For the 40th anniversary of Israel, we had a huge military parade. A few days later, I was in the West Bank. I came across a group of young Palestinians. They knew me from TV. And one of them said, "Yesterday I saw all your fighter aircraft. You're so strong up there. But what can you do against stone throwers down here?" This was our problem, and the young people's power.
You know that if you beat them and shoot them and do whatever you want to them, they won't stop. We train to fight against the other soldiers. Now we fight against the people. It's difficult.
Increasingly, Israelis asked themselves whether they could rule more than 1 million Palestinians in the occupied territories forever.
We can't solve this problem. It's the government, it's the politician have to solve the problem, not we are.
The Intifada vented Palestinian frustration, but it also demonstrated that neither terrorism nor street revolt would solve their political problems. In Tunis, one PLO leader discussed what to do next with a colleague.
We sat there alone. I said, "I want to talk about something I've never mentioned before. Can I raise a taboo subject?" He said, "Be my guest."
The PLO had been created to reclaim all of Israel for the Palestinians. Now Abu Mazen suggested that they be realistic, that the only way to get back Gaza and the West Bank was to accept what they rejected 40 years ago, the partition of Palestine.
I asked him, should we consider recognizing Israel? He said yes.
Yasser Arafat was eventually convinced that the PLO would have to compromise. But the other PLO leaders were harder to persuade. Like Sadat, the PLO preferred to negotiate through the Americans. But the Americans laid down a condition. Yasser Arafat, the world's most famous guerrilla leader, would have to renounce terrorism.
He's got to get up in front of a television camera or in some public way and say, for everybody to see him saying it out of his own mouth, these things.
The UN General Assembly gathered in Geneva for a special session to hear Arafat. But not all the factions of the PLO were willing to negotiate.
We did not accept the decision to recognize Israel. We would accept no further compromise.
Arafat's UN speech would be a difficult balancing act.
I hereby once more declare that I condemn terrorism in all its forms.
That was for the Americans. And in a pattern that was to characterize the whole speech, the next phrase was for the PLO radicals.
And at the same time, salute those sitting before me in this hall who, in the days when they fought to free their countries from the yoke of colonialism, were accused of terrorism.
He concluded his speech convinced he had pleased everyone.
I reviewed it with President Reagan, who was following this closely. And I said, well, Mr. President, in one part of his statement he said, unk, unk, unk. And the other part of his statement he said, cull, cull, cull. But nowhere did he say uncle. So, no, it's not satisfactory.
Word soon came that the Americans had rejected the Balancing Act. Arafat's closest advisors implored him to say exactly what Schultz demanded.
I saw that Arafat had a dilemma, whether to say it or not. Should he sit tight, or should he try again?
The next morning, Arafat called a press conference.
I repeat for the record that we totally and absolutely renounce all forms of terrorism.
I view this development as one more step toward the beginning of direct negotiations between the parties, which alone can lead to such a peace.
But Israel's prime minister was unimpressed.
Shamir made a gesture. It meant, this isn't important. Let's not waste time analyzing what Arafat said.
We cannot trust them. They are criminals, they are liars, they are enemies of our people.
Shamir's view of Arafat was reinforced 18 months later. On August 2, 1990, Iraq's Saddam Hussein sent his army into Kuwait. He boasted that in a war, Israel would end up in flames. Saddam's only support came from Libya, Sudan, and the PLO.
You know, the war will not be only in Baghdad. This war, if it starts, it will be in the whole area. For this, it will be a real catastrophe.
Israel prepared for an attack. As President Bush set out to build a coalition to force Saddam out of Kuwait, he traveled to Damascus to bring Syria into the fold. But President Assad, a firm Arab nationalist, was not easy to convince.
President Assad made very clear to me that he blamed Israel for everything. I'm not sure he blamed him for Iraq going into Kuwait, but he got almost everything. Everything was all about Israel. I made clear to him that we didn't want to link any Middle East peace process talks to whipping Saddam Hussein. But I made clear to him also that we would be involved in trying to be a catalyst for peace for Arabs and Israelis.
As the war started, Saddam ordered an attack on Israel with Scud missiles. Saddam hoped that by attacking Israel, he would get the support of other Arab countries. If Israel retaliated, he might be able to undermine the coalition against him. Iraq's missiles were aimed in